Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today, we are going to go back into the Directors series with a look at my favorite comedy director of all time, and by my opinion, the best comedy director of all time in Mel Brooks. And before I get into his early filmography, it is important to remember that Mel Brooks did get his start in television. After he got out of the army after World War II, he proceeded to go to LA, and he then proceeded to get into a writer's room, and he managed to start working on several series at the time, most notably the Sid Caesar Show. Sid Caesar was he was a comedian at the time who had his own kind of variety show, similar to like a Red Skelton in a sense, where he had these little comedy skits that he'd do on the show. And Brooks was one of the head writers for that, and that's really what kind of got his start in Hollywood. And then, of course, he would go on to be a mainstream director, producer, and writer, as well as acting in many of his own films and others. So after the Sid Caesar Show in the mid to late '60s. Brooks started working on his first theatrical film project, which was The Producers. Now, The Producers was huge, huge, huge for Mel Brooks, because when you look at The Producers now, it was remade, I believe, in 2005, but the original Producers from 1967 is a great film. It's an early role. I don't remember if it's the first role, but it is a very early role for Gene Wilder. And he was starring alongside a veteran, several veteran actors, actually. And he did an amazing job. He was nominated, I believe, I can't remember if it was Best Supporting Actor or Best Actor, but he was nominated for one of those two at the Oscars that year, as well as The Producers itself winning an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. But in relation to that, you have all of these kind of characters that kind of came to life in that movie, and there was some very interesting kind of behind the scenes stuff. There's a very famous scene where Gene Wilder kind of has an on-screen freak out, essentially, where it's kind of funny, where he basically he starts talking really fast. He starts going nuts, and the whole movie is basically about these two guys who are producers, and they try to produce a play, a Broadway play that's an intentional flop in order to invest as little money as possible so that they can make a profit. And essentially, they're trying to scam the system. So they find this guy who's he's insane, essentially. They find him on a rooftop with a bunch of pigeons, and he's a Nazi, and he's wearing, it's kind of goofy, and it's kind of edgy, too, especially for something like 1967. The World War II had only been over for about 20 years at that point. It wasn't necessarily a whole it wasn't that long a period of time after the war had actually ended that they were doing that movie. And he has this play that he wants to produce. It's called Springtime for Hitler, and it has some of the most outrageous and insane musical numbers I have ever seen. And that's another hallmark of Mel Brooks that people would come to know in later years, was that he was very adept at writing music, or not necessarily writing the actual tunes, but writing the lyrics to music. And that's also why The Producers wound up much later on becoming a celebrated Broadway play, in no small part to Mel Brooks. So that was really his jumping off point. And Mel Brooks actually credits Gene Wilder with a lot of his success from that film. And I remember I've seen the video of his acceptance speech at the Oscars in 1968. When he accepted the award for Best Adapted Screenplay, and one of the first things he said was, "Thank you, Gene Wilder. Thank you, Gene Wilder. Thank you, Gene Wilder." And that would set up their work in the future as well, because obviously Gene Wilder would come back to star in Brooks films in 1974 with Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, respectively. Now, actually, sorry, I kind of got off track there a little bit, but there's a scene in The Producers where Gene Wilder is kind of going a little insane. He's talking really, really fast. And there's kind of a famous scene where they splash water on him to try and calm him down. He says, "Now I'm wet." It's kind of funny. And Mel Brooks actually had the idea to basically have Gene Wilder drink coffee. And Gene Wilder apparently had never had coffee before. And Mel Brooks basically forced him to drink coffee and then do that scene. So he was extremely hyperactive. And that also adds to that scene. It's extremely funny. And like I said, that was one of the films that really jump-started Gene Wilder's career. He was in a lot of films after that. Like I said, the other Brooks films. And then he also went on to do a lot of films with Richard Pryor, like Stir Crazy and See No Evil, Hear No Evil, and a lot of other ones. So now that we move past the producers, which again kind of really gave a lot of room to Mel Brooks, and when we move past that, we start to reach. There was a little bit of a dip there where we had a movie of his that wasn't as successful as the producers, but then again, the movie did win Oscars, so it's kind of a you're gonna have a little bit of a sophomore slump. It's called The 12 Chairs. I've personally never seen it. It has an interesting plot line, but again, it was kind of one of those movies. It came out in 1970. It's not really remembered very well. It's kind of a bit of a low point. This is what I consider kind of Brooks's early career as the producers, and then 12 Chairs. But then we move into the meat of his career, which is from 1974 to 1987. And this 1974 is really Brooks's breakout year. That is when he did, in the early part of 1974, you had Blazing Saddles, and then later that year you had Young Frankenstein, both starring Blazing Saddles, I believe, is technically co-starring Gene Wilder, but he was a major character in it. You also had Cletus Little, who was in that movie, and I've gone over Blazing Saddles at length of its importance to comedy and the reason why it is important to comedy at a point where that movie is not playing it safe, and it should not play it safe. And that's kind of one of the things about Mel Brooks' comedy, especially after this point, is that Mel Brooks did not pull any punches in terms of, he wasn't gonna sanitize his comedies. Essentially, he was gonna make the movie that he wanted to make, and it was very obvious from that point on that he was going to do that, and to great and successful effect, he did it. But you had Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, which are two hilarious movies. And like I said, I've gone over Blazing Saddles quite a bit. I'm going to go into Young Frankenstein a bit more now. If you want to know more about Blazing Saddles, you can watch my full video on it, where I go over the film and its importance to comedy. But I'm just going to go into Young Frankenstein and kind of skip over that a little bit, where Young Frankenstein was kind of a movie where Mel Brooks has said on more than one occasion that he really loved horror films when he was growing up. And one of his favorite films was the original Frankenstein from Universal Pictures, directed by James Wales. And that he wanted to do essentially a spoof/homage to that film called Young Frankenstein, where Gene Wilder plays the grandson of Victor Frankenstein, and he goes and creates his own monster. And he does a great job at not only spoofing the original Frankenstein, but also giving us an entirely hilarious movie. And there's a specific scene in the movie that has a little behind-the-scenes info on it, which is hilarious, where it's a scene in the middle where actually Gene Wilder and Marty Feldman are ad-libbing the entire scene, but they had to do it multiple times, so it might as well have been scripted. But it's a scene where Madeline Kahn, who plays Gene Wilder's fiance, shows up at Frankenstein Castle, and they then proceed to bring their bags inside. But there's a part in there where Marty Feldman as Igor, Madeline Kahn is wearing a white fox like scarf, and he leans over and starts like biting the scarf. And apparently during that scene, every single person who was on, the actors and the studio people, the people that were behind the camera, all the film crew, all just broke down laughing because it was so funny. And I can understand it. That scene is hilarious, and to be there seeing that live is probably even funnier. But they had to do the take almost, I think, over 40 times. And eventually Mel Brooks just got sick of it, and he cut and he wrapped, and they wrapped for the day. And that afternoon he went down to a fabric store that was down the street from the studio that they were working at, and he ordered enough cloth handkerchiefs for the entire film crew. And the next day they came back and they tried to film the scene again. And he told the entire crew, he says, if you think you are going to laugh, put this over your face so you shut up. Because I don't want to film this thing 50 more times to get it right. So they wound up filming it twice. The second time that they managed to actually get it down, and Mel Brooks stated that when he turned around, every single person in the room had their face covered in these white handkerchiefs, which is kind of amusing. And again, it just shows that Mel Brooks, even though he was comedically, he was a genius, both in terms of his writing and in terms of his directing. He wasn't afraid to let his actors kind of cut loose every once in a while, and it ultimately it makes the films better and it makes the working relationship better in that scenario. I kind of made that message with Kubrick, because the Kubrick, he was more of a person, he ruled over his set with an iron fist, essentially. He was almost a movie dictator. But Mel Brooks was willing to let kind of things slide just to see kind of what happens. And I think you can see a lot of that in his films, where he had this really close working relationship with Gene Wilder and Peter Boyle, who plays the monster in that film. You had some Brooks regulars, aside from Wilder, who were in that, including Madeline Kahn and Cloris Leachman. And then, of course, you had Marty Feldman. But those two movies are really what put Mel Brooks' name on the map in terms of Hollywood directing. That was like those two movies. After that, it was like, when's the next Mel Brooks movie coming out? And the next one, which premiered in 1976, was Silent Movie. Now, this was a bit of an offshoot for Mel Brooks. I personally don't really care that much for this movie because I'm not a huge silent movie fan, because he did remove sound. And the entire message for this movie was that first Mel Brooks took away color, and now he's going to take away sound. Because A Young Frankenstein was filmed in black and white, even though it was filmed in 1974 as a homage to James Whale's. And the studios actually had a very serious problem with them doing that, and Mel Brooks had to do a lot of negotiating to make sure they couldn't, screw him behind the scenes and release it in color later on. So for them to allow him to do that afterwards, mainly just because I think the Young Frankenstein was such a huge success, just showed kind of their confidence in him at that point, because he had 4 films under his belt. 3 of them were extremely successful. But then Silent Movie was kind of a meh. I haven't really seen Silent Movie. I don't really care to. It doesn't seem like it's going to jump out at me that much. It's more of that Charlie Chaplin type of humor that you can kind of get, or like Buster Keaton, similar to that kind of stuff, which I can watch it, but it's not my cup of tea. But if you're interested in silent movies and stuff, I think that would be a great watch for you, because I'm sure it would be hilarious. But again, it's kind of a homage to that Charlie Chaplin type of silent film that Mel Brooks probably grew up with. Then you move into kind of the late 70s and all the way into the 80s. And you have kind of Mel Brooks went on this almost like a spoofing spree, starting with Blazing Saddles, where you have Blazing Saddles obviously spoofing Westerns. You had Young Frankenstein, which is spoofing horror films, or Frankenstein specifically. Silent Movie, which is spoofing silent films. And then you go into High Anxiety. Now, High Anxiety was a spoof on Hitchcock. And it tackled, for the most part, it kind of tackled Vertigo. And again, that's where the name comes from. It's High Anxiety. It's a joke on, obviously, it's a play on words with Vertigo. And this movie also stars Mel Brooks, which is the first time that we kind of see that. He plays bit parts in some of the other movies that he's done. Blazing Saddles, he plays the governor of the territory. But High Anxiety is the first, really actually the only movie that I can think of that Mel Brooks actually directed where he was the head star of the film. And again, in High Anxiety, you kind of see that he's brought back his stable of actors again. You have Madeline Kahn, who had appeared in both Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. You had Harvey Korman, who had again, he had been in Blazing Saddles. I don't believe he was in Young Frankenstein. And you kind of go with this movie where, like I was saying before, Mel Brooks, this is the first time and really the only time in the films that he actually directed that he was the lead in the film. And he does a really good job at being extremely funny. and it's almost a literal movie. If you're a fan of Hitchcock, I would 100% suggest watching this film. If you don't know a damn thing about Hitchcock, you're not going to get a lot of the jokes that are in the film. Some of the stuff. I mean, some of the stuff you might find humorous, but you won't get the context. Is what I'm saying. There's a scene where Mel Brooks is in the park and these birds start crapping on him, and they keep following him until he gets into this little shack, and they poop on him through like a hole in the roof, and the whole joke is supposed to be on the birds again, where Tippi Hedren is running through the house and there's a hole in the roof and she's getting attacked by the birds and stuff. It's the same idea. But if you don't know the context, you're not going to get that joke. They do a homage to the shower scene from Psycho that's very amusing. But the whole thing is basically kind of like one of those Hitchcock thrillers. It's Vertigo mixed kind of with like a North by Northwest type of feel, and it's very, very good. It's one of the better spoofs, I would say, of the genre. Even though it's mainly spoofing Vertigo, it does touch on a lot of Hitchcock's other films or other more notable films. Reportedly, it was actually funny. I guess Mel Brooks screened the film with Hitchcock at the time, and Hitchcock actually got a pretty good kick out of it, apparently. But we move on from High Anxiety over on to the next film in his filmography, which was History of the World Part 1. Now, this is one that people kind of glaze over. I personally enjoy it. It's filled with a good amount of musical numbers. The Inquisition musical number is one of the funniest songs I think I've seen, along with the accompanying dialogue. There's some work by Jackie Mason there, who makes an appearance, who's very, very funny. And the Inquisition, what a show! I mean, if you look it up, you'll see it. And you'll think it's hilarious. But that was kind of the thing with Mel Brooks too, is that he wasn't afraid to kind of go after certain things. The Inquisition was the Spanish Inquisition was a horrible, horrible event in history. A lot of Jewish people died, and it was really horrific. But he just makes you crack up laughing watching it. Some of the bigger segments have some of his better lines. You have of course, the great segment with the French Revolution. It's good to be the king. I think everybody remembers that line for the most part, which is one of the better ones. The Roman Empire one is good as well. And again, you have some of his returning cast. You have Madeline Kahn and a few others that come back from his previous films. But History of the World Part 1 is a great watch. Also, there's a cameo at the very beginning in a caveman segment where you see Sid Caesar, who, again, was a good friend of Mel Brooks at the time. Mel Brooks had worked on his television show very early in his career. So that's an interesting thing to kind of watch out for. And the physical comedy is actually extremely good in that. And of course, Mel Brooks has his roles in it. He jumps in a few points. He's the lead he plays Comicus in the Roman Empire section. He's a random caveman in the first section, the prehistoric section, and then he also plays King Louis XVI, as well as the Piss Boy in the final segment, which is the French Revolution, along with Harvey Korman, who again comes back from High Anxiety and Blazing Saddles. History of the World Part 1, it's kind of an underrated film for him. It really is. It's a very underrated film for him. And when you kind of watch that movie, it feels a lot like a lot of other movies that he's done. It's a vignette movie, which is a bit different than his other films, most of which are all pretty much straightforward. There's not a whole lot of films that he does that are really just kind of like in stories and stuff like that. And then they have a great teaser at the end for it. Can't wait for History of the World Part 2, which was never made. They do a few things. They go Hitler on Ice and a few other ones. Jews in Space, which is a great one, which is kind of spoofing the pigs in space from the Muppets. Although I'm not sure which one came first. I think the Muppet one did. But then we move on into Brooks's kind of his last really big film that kind of hit it off, which was in 1987's Spaceballs. Now, Spaceballs was a movie that came out, and it was spoofing Star Wars. Um, it had really a great comedic cast, and it didn't have a whole lot of Brooks regulars. You had John Candy, who plays the Chewbacca anagram called Barf, he's a Mog. He's half man, half dog. He's his own best friend. That was a really good one. You have Rick Moranis, who comes in to play the Darth Vader anagram, Darth Helmet. Um, you have Bill Pullman in an early role, who comes in as Lone Star, who's kind of a combination of Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. Joan Rivers, who comes in playing the C-3PO lookalike, and it's just an awesome kind of combination of comedy actors making fun of a franchise that everybody loved. And again, this is 4 years after Return of the Jedi came out, so everybody knew about Star Wars. It wasn't one of those things that just, people are kind of, it wasn't like in the middle and like, oh, they're kind of spoofing this random thing, or they're spoofing like the first episode, the first Star Wars movie or something. They did a very, very good job at kind of picking that apart. And the merchandising thing is actually really hilarious too, where Mel Brooks plays this, he plays, he's supposed to be kind of like Yoda. He calls himself Yogurt. And, he has a whole thing of Spaceballs merchandise, kind of joking about the Star Wars merchandise, how it basically ballooned out of control, and there's just so much of it everywhere. So everything in the mid to late '80s had practically everything in a toy store or anywhere else had a Star Wars logo on it. They do a few kind of insane ones, like Spaceballs, the toilet paper, and they do a joke on it later on as well. Where they have a bathroom and you see Spaceballs, the toilet paper has Darth Helmet on the rolls of toilet paper, which is pretty funny. But that's the thing that Mel Brooks was really good at, is kind of dissecting what a spoof should be, and he really never went into the territory of so goofy that it didn't work. And when I say goofy that it didn't work, I mean goofy that it doesn't make sense. Like, if they make a joke in Spaceballs, it makes sense to Spaceballs, and you can relate it back to Star Wars. There's a funny scene where Bill Pullman and Rick Moranis are supposed to be fighting with these, basically their lightsabers, and they relate them to dicks, and it's kind of funny because you look at Star Wars and you kind of see how they're holding the lightsabers sometimes, and it kind of looks like that. So it wasn't. They weren't these like random jokes that didn't make sense or didn't relate back to the source material. They always did it correctly, and that was the best part. So now we move on to. I'm going to skip over the film Life Stinks, because that's kind of just like a weird one, and this is essentially Brooks's later career, going into the early to mid '90s, and this is really when he stopped directing in 1995. He still produced, and he still does voice work and some acting work. But his directing ended in 1995. Now, Life Stinks came out in 1991. It's kind of like Changing Places, except there isn't somebody to go into the rich guy's point of view. And if you don't know what Changing Places is, it's a movie with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy from the 80s, where a rich guy gets bankrupt and turns into a poor person, and they give Eddie Murphy a bunch of money and make him into a rich person. And it's supposed to be changing the aspects of life, or their lives, essentially switching them. And Bill Murray, not Bill Murray, in the Mel Brooks film, it's kind of the same idea, except he bets that basically he can live on like the streets of New York for, I think it's a month or something like that, or a period of time in order to get a bunch of money. But it's ultimately I personally don't think that film is very good. So we're going to move on to another one that's kind of a sleeper for him. Again, his later two films, I actually really do enjoy both of his last two films. Even though they weren't as big a hit at the box office. And Robin Hood Men in Tights was the first one, which came out in 1993. And again, this is one of those films that it has those stereotypical Mel Brooks type of jokes in it, where you have kind of these literal jokes. Where there's actually a really funny scene where the I forget who the actor is. He played the main protagonist in Princess Bride, but he comes back again for this film to play Robin Hood, or Robin of Locksley. And he comes to his home, and they're like dragging away his home, which is a big castle. The only thing that's left is the foundation and his blind caretaker called Blinken, which is hilarious. You know, he does a few kind of funny things through it. There's a scene where he's supposed to be fighting with a sword. He doesn't realize that he's actually fighting with with an inanimate object that's a wooden beam, and he's actually just like carving it up with a sword. He doesn't actually realize that he's not fighting an actual person. But you know, Robin Hood Men in Tights is kind of one of those sleeper ones. The jokes are still funny. It still works. Some parts of it are just goddamn hilarious. The duel part, the part where Robin challenges the sheriff of Nottingham to a duel, is probably one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Where the sheriff slaps him with his glove, and then Robin Hood picks up a gauntlet off of the dinner table and whacks him in the face with it and knocks him out. And it's an extremely funny scene, just because it's so nonchalant and it's played so deadpan when he does it. It's not like, oh, hey, look what I got, and then smacks him in the face. He just grabs it and hits him. You know, but again, that's kind of the thing that Mel Brooks knew how to do. He knew how to get a laugh out of you. When you have a proven formula that works in terms of a scene construction with jokes, you can keep that going as long as people are still find it funny. What a lot of people don't understand sometimes is they try to change up the formula. What you really don't want to do is change up the formula. You want to change up the variables. The joke is still going to work, but you need to change up the variables that go into the joke. And that was what Mel Brooks was really, really good at. Is he didn't necessarily tell you the same joke twice, but he made it seem original, but he still kind of followed a little bit of a formula. And you know, after Robin Hood Men in Tights, we go into Dracula Dead and Loving It, which is unfortunately his first collaboration with Leslie Nielsen, who plays Dracula in the film. And we have returning Mel Brooks regular and Harvey Korman, who comes back. And I think he's the only regular besides Mel Brooks who makes a small appearance, an appearance as Van Helsing. I actually really enjoy this movie. It's kind of, you know, I also enjoy Leslie Nielsen comedies, you know, like Airplane and stuff like that, and Naked Gun. But it was kind of one of those movies that, again, it was at the tail end of Mel Brooks' career. People were I think moviegoers may have been kind of sick of that brand of humor. It was essentially dying out. The spoof age was really mostly the 1980s, and, well, the 70s and the 80s for the most part. That was kind of the spoof age. And when you go into the early and mid 90s, that was kind of dying out. It was going more into the buddy comedy stuff, stuff like Black Sheep or Tommy Boy that were coming out at the time. You know, stuff like that was making it really, really big. And Mel Brooks' kind of brand of comedy was falling out. Didn't make it any less funny, at least in my opinion. But unfortunately, it did have a reflection on the box office where people were not going to see those films anymore. And I think that's why Mel Brooks kind of stopped. That's why Mel Brooks stopped doing films in 1995, because, you know, he realized that if he kept making films the way that he was just essentially going to turn into a laughing stock, not in a good way. But it was kind of that same idea where he knew that that brand of film was dying out, and he wasn't going to go down with the ship. Essentially, he was going to leave on a relative high note. You know, even though Dracula Dead and Loving It was not considered a financial success, I believe at the time, he did essentially want to go out where at least he was confident that he made a funny film. So, you know, we're gonna go off on that, and you know, that's kind of the thing when you look at Mel Brooks' filmography in terms of a director. He only directed 11 films. He wrote all of them, to my knowledge, and especially the bigger ones. I know for a fact that he wrote most of the ones and all the ones I mentioned here. But he is he's one of the most successful directors in Hollywood, and he's basically operated in a single genre his entire career. And that is almost insane. when you think about it, that a lot of these directors that we kind of think of the top echelon of their craft, most of them operate in multiple genres. You look at guys like Steven Spielberg or Stanley Kubrick, stuff like that. They all operate in multiple genres. But Mel Brooks has essentially thrived in the comedy genre his entire career, and he has just made a name for himself. And that's not even necessarily as a film director as well, because Mel Brooks is I believe he is the only person in Hollywood to have won an Oscar, which he won for The Producers. He's won Emmy Awards for his work on TV with the Sid Caesar Show. He also worked on Get Smart, the original one from the 60s, as well as Mad About You. And then you also have, he's won Writers Guild Awards as well, but out of the big four, he's also won Tony Awards, which was insane. He won for the producers musical that went on Broadway in 2001. He's one of the only people. He's won Grammys, he's won Tonys, he's won an Oscar, and he's won Emmys. So he's basically won in all four major visual mediums: television, movies, theater, and I guess music technically doesn't count because it's more of an auditory. But he's one of the four major accolades, which again I think he's the only person to have ever done that. And looking back on his career, nobody else has done for the comedy genre what he did, and that was to just bring comedy to comedies back then. You had stuff before that. You had like the you had older stuff like the Three Stooges and Abbott and Costello, stuff in the 30s and 40s, which is I'm sure stuff that Mel Brooks grew up with or at least watched at the time. And then you also had you had the variety shows and stuff like that. But comedy was kind of relegated to, all right, the funny guys are kind of over here. They're not really the big stars. With maybe a few exceptions like Jerry Lewis or stuff like that. But he brought it up to the mainstream where you had somebody who was directing comedies who was winning Oscars, and somebody who was getting, he was nominated for other ones as well. He was nominated, I believe, for 3 Oscars. He won the one for The Producers, and then I think he was nominated for Blazing Saddle, a couple for Blazing Saddles as well. But you had a guy who was doing comedies that was getting nominated for Oscars. That doesn't happen anymore. When was the last time you saw a comedy get nominated for a major Oscar or anything like that? Or when was the last time you saw a major comedy television show nowadays get nominated for Emmys? Actually, I shouldn't say that because there are still comedy shows that win Emmys, but the Oscars one is more of a blatant one. It's kind of like the horror genre almost, where you don't really see horror movies get nominated for Oscars that much anymore either. Jordan Peele's kind of changed that with the Get Out, but for the most part, it's been kind of scarce. But that's just kind of the thing with Mel Brooks, is you have to look at his career, and one of the things that I think really defines him is that he was never a person who was going to apologize for his comedy. He is not there. He said it himself. He's not there to offend you. His job is to entertain. But at the same time, if you get offended at something that he's trying to make light of, he's trying to make funny, then that's your problem. It's not his. His job is to make things funny. He thinks it's funny, and a lot of people think that it's funny. And that's kind of something that people forget about comedy, especially these days. And it's something that people should be reminded of and should remember, is that, look, even though you don't like it, that doesn't necessarily give you a right to say it's wrong in a lot of cases. Because the point of comedy is to make you laugh. And with that, I think we'll close it. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. Thank everybody for helping the channel grow. We've grown quite a bit in the last 3 or 4, last probably week or two. So leave in the comments what you think about Mel Brooks as a director, as an actor, as a writer, as a producer. All the things that he's done. Essentially a renaissance man of film and other genres. Leave a like on the video, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?